On Friday, June 24th, the Russian Federation nearly fell into a civil war, and it could happen again, this time with more disastrous consequences. It all began with Yevgeny Prigozhin and his infamous Wagner Group. The private military company has become one of the most powerful fighting forces inside of Ukraine, and according to the Ukrainians themselves, is a better fighting force than the regular Russian army. While technically PMCs are illegal under Russian law, Russian President Vladimir Putin allowed Prigozhin to create the Wagner Group so it could originally be used as an extension of the Russian government itself, undertaking operations around the world on behalf of Russian interests while providing plausible deniability. By doing this, Putin had planted the seeds of his own downfall. Wagner quickly grew from a small, light infantry force into a formidable army in its own right. Unlike other PMCs, Wagner operates a significant amount of its own heavy equipment, including main battle tanks, artillery, air defenses, and even helicopters. The group has operations all over the world, but its most valuable assets are multiple mines in Africa, which enrich Prigozhin and make Wagner a self-funded operation, nearly completely independent of the Russian government. It's this independence that would prove deadly to Vladimir Putin, who hadn't realized that he'd given his favorite dog way too much leash. Details remain incredibly thin, and by the time you see this video, we might have learned new things or corrected some of the information presented here. However, what we do know is that the seeds of Russia's greatest internal catastrophe since the fall of the Soviet Union were planted in the Battle of Bakhmut. The town was strategically insignificant save for one thing: the Russians wanted it badly. When Ukraine realized just how many casualties the Russian Federation was willing to tolerate for its capture, it immediately became a focal point of the entire war. The formerly strategically worthless town was now on the lips of every observer around the world, quickly becoming the greatest repository of sunflower fertilizer as the Russians continued to stack up their casualties attempting to take it. Russia has not had a very good time during this war, and Vladimir Putin was desperate for a win. Hot on the heels of the stunning Ukrainian fall counterattack, the Russian army needed an ideological victory, and for a whole lot of really stupid reasons, Bakhmut became that victory. Suffering anywhere between a 5-1 to a 7-1 casualty disparity, Russia nevertheless managed to push the Ukrainians back slowly, meter by meter over the course of a 10-month-long battle. Somewhere around the midpoint, though, as casualties and costs were skyrocketing, Prigozhin attempted to strike a deal with Ukrainian intelligence. Now, Prigozhin has vehemently denied this, but given current events, there's little reason left to doubt Ukraine's intelligence agencies. According to them, Prigozhin reached out and offered a deal. In exchange for Bakhmut, he would give them the precise locations and dispositions of nearby Russian units. This would enable Ukraine to launch devastating attacks against Russian regular army forces, and all they had to do was give up a strategically worthless town that was nothing more than a propaganda victory. Prigozhin and Wagner would be heroes while gaining nothing really, and Ukraine could inflict a serious hurt on the Russian army. The Battle of Bakhmut was too profitable for Ukraine to strike a deal over, with the Russians stacking their dead like cordwood trying to take it. There was little reason to launch surprise attacks against any exposed army units outside of it. Besides, it's unlikely that Prigozhin's intelligence was significantly more valuable and accurate than what Ukraine was already getting from Western intelligence agencies, especially the United States and its constellation of spy satellites and wealth of intelligence sources inside the Russian army itself. With no deal, the slog for Bakhmut continued, and the mounting costs quickly created tensions within the Russian war effort itself. Prigozhin already had significant differences with Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and his direct number one Chief of the General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov. The rivalry had stemmed from a number of sources, but chief amongst them had been several high-profile incidents between Wagner and the Russian army, with each blaming the other of purposefully sabotaging each other's efforts. The rivalry came to a head during the conquest of Solidar, a salt mining town that Wagner bled hard to push the Ukrainians out of, only for the Russian army to swoop in at the last minute and claim victory, stealing Wagner's glory out from under them. The rivalry was not entirely by accident either. Dictators like Vladimir Putin tend to play their subordinates against each other. That way they don't band together to pose a challenge. This likely saved Putin's life in Wagner's insurrection, as it was only the rivalry between Shoigu and Prigozhin that prevented Wagner and the Russian regular army from banding together on the march to Moscow. Indeed, we have reports of many regular Russian units refusing to stop Prigozhin's Wagner forces, and some even joining him. Had this happened en masse, Putin would have gone the way of countless Russian dictators before him into an early and permanent retirement 6 feet underground. But the rivalry between the army and Wagner was toxic to the Russian war effort and has directly led to Russia's general incompetence in its effort to defeat the much smaller and less well-equipped Ukraine. There are credible allegations of Wagner leaking intelligence to the Ukrainians on the location of Russian officers they wanted to see dead, only for Uncle HIMARS to pay a swift visit with several hundred pounds of high explosives. Indeed, Russia's loss rate for senior officers has been nothing short of apocalyptic. There are also known incidents of Wagner and the Russian army engaging in brief skirmishes, famously with one Russian colonel ordering Wagner's exit route out of Bakhmut to be mined. For Ukraine, the beef between Wagner and the Russian army has been a godsend. It ensures that Ukraine isn't facing a unified invasion force, but rather a multitude of individual armies, all working for their own interests. None of these forces are incentivized to work together, and indeed purposefully keep vital intelligence to themselves so as to sabotage each other. This was on full display during the Battle of Volodar, when Wagner, Patriot PMC, and the Russian army all refused to share intelligence, leading to each of the three organizations' forces falling into the exact same ambushes. It would become the greatest tank battle of the war, with 120 armored vehicles destroyed on the Russian side. With Ukraine being steadily pushed out of Bakhmut, though, the rivalry intensified between Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense. Both sides were out for the glory of capturing Bakhmut. If the 10-month campaign resulting in an estimated 100,000 casualties both in and around Bakhmut could in any way be called glorious. As Wagner pushed the Ukrainians to the very outskirts of town, the Russian army began to launch an attempted pincer attack to beat Wagner there. Prigozhin was furious and began to claim that the Russian army was purposefully denying his troops the ammunition needed to finish the fight. This lack of ammo was costing his men lives, and Prigozhin put out a series of very emotional and very staged videos of himself ranting against the Russian MOD in front of dead Russian casualties. It was all a show, of course. Prigozhin never once cared about the casualties on either side, but the show has recently been revealed to be even bigger than any of us knew. The world was buying Prigozhin's narrative of Ministry of Defense cutting him off from supplies, and to an extent this was apparently true. When he threatened to remove Wagner from Bakhmut on May 10th, the MOD opened up the taps and let the ammo and shells flow, only to shut off the tap again 2 days later, sparking fresh protests from Prigozhin. But American intelligence had secretly confirmed that Wagner was not, in fact, facing an ammo shortage. They were simply making it look that way. Instead, Prigozhin had begun to secretly order caches of supplies to be moved to rear areas near the Russian border. While no one yet knows when Prigozhin had made up his mind to attempt a coup, it seems that he was already preparing for it by the start of May. Here's where the details remain very sketchy, and more will come out in time. However, we know the key elements of Prigozhin's brief coup. It all began with what many are convinced was a false flag attack by Wagner forces on itself. Prigozhin claimed that the Russian army had shelled one of his camps, killing many of his fighters. This was backed up by video evidence of the aftermath of what appeared to be an artillery strike, though immediately most observers noted that the footage did not in any way show evidence of a mass artillery strike as claimed by Prigozhin. There was also a significant lack of casualties on video, with only one body and several body parts, evidence of some casualties, but not the mass casualties claimed by Prigozhin. In retaliation, Prigozhin launched what he called a March for Justice. Careful not to term his invasion of Russia a coup, Wagner crossed into Russia via multiple points and headed for the headquarters of the Southern Military District, the city of Rostov-on-Don. We know that some Russian forces were sent to attempt to slow down his estimated 15,000 to 25,000 strong force, but per Prigozhin himself, they allowed him and his forces to simply pass on by. Indeed, there is no evidence of anything but very brief and sporadic gun battles between Wagner and Russian military forces. Upon reaching the city of Rostov-on-Don, Wagner surrounded key buildings including the municipal center, the FSB headquarters, and the headquarters of the Southern Military District. Other than one explosion attributed to an anti-tank mine that may have accidentally detonated, there was no violence reported. Indeed, local police forces were seen on video casually greeting Wagnerites in the city. Prigozhin did claim that the Russian Air Force had attempted to attack his column with a helicopter, which according to Wagner destroyed a civilian bus traveling alongside the Wagner troops. In return, Wagner downed at least 3 Russian helicopters and later a Russian Il-18 aircraft. Leaving a small contingent behind in Rostov, Prigozhin marched north, and hours later was confirmed by British intelligence to have captured the major city of Voronezh, along with all of its military facilities. Here, there were more reports of combat between Wagner and Russian forces, and Russia appeared to attack its own oil facility with a Ka-52 attack helicopter in order to deny the supplies to Wagner. However, any regular army resistance was swiftly overcome, and the march toward Moscow continued. As Moscow scrambled to set up defenses, it quickly became apparent to observers why Wagner was seemingly unstoppable. Having scoured social media for video and footage uploaded by Muscovites themselves, we were unable to spot anything more than a handful of armored personnel carriers and some helicopters being deployed by the Russian army, along with some armored trucks from reserve forces. In just one clip shot by a passerby of the Wagner convoy, however, we counted 4 T-72 tanks, numerous infantry fighting vehicles, a Panzer air defense unit, and multiple towed artillery systems. Basically, Wagner was significantly outgunning the Russian army by any measure according to all available info from the time. With so much of its reserve inventory dedicated to Ukraine, it comes as no surprise that the Russian military was incapable of stopping an invasion of its own territory, begging the question of what would happen if Ukraine were to suddenly do the same thing. However, while Wagner was significantly outgunning anything the Russian army could muster together, there was no political support coming for Prigozhin. This might have been instrumental to him canceling his march on Moscow. After a series of negotiations with Belarus's Lukashenko, Prigozhin announced to end his coup attempt and ordered Wagner forces back into field camps. In exchange, Wagner and Prigozhin received a blanket pardon from Vladimir Putin, and Prigozhin was allowed to leave Russia for Belarus. The question on everyone's mind, though, is why did Prigozhin launch this short-lived coup, and why did he stop it when it was so wildly successful? Details remain scarce, but we can piece together some solid theories based off information available. First, it became evident at the end of the first 24 hours that while Prigozhin lacked political support, he was enjoying a significant amount of popular support where Wagner traveled. After the end of the coup was announced, massive crowds gathered at Rostov-on-Don to cheer on Wagner as it departed the city, with crowds chanting Wagner and Prigozhin's name. There are also very credible reports of Russian army units refusing to engage Wagner, and a small number of soldiers even joining them outright. Online, Prigozhin's announcement over Telegram that he was canceling the operation was met with a flood of negative responses from tens of thousands of people who apparently wanted him to continue. But the wave of popular support wasn't immediately visible to anyone inside of Russia, thanks to the government's crackdown on social media and internet use. Prigozhin might not have known just how many were cheering him on back in the occupied Rostov-on-Don, or the amount of popularity he was gaining on social media. Before the coup, Prigozhin was not well known to most Russians thanks to a media ban on mentioning him or Wagner and the careful curating of news inside Russia to make the Russian army look like heroes. However, Prigozhin has surged in popularity since the coup. Had he known this, perhaps he would have continued marching on Moscow. With no politicians declaring their support for Wagner, though, it might have been prudent to end the march when he did. While he could have easily taken Moscow and forced Putin into exile, Prigozhin would have lacked any serious credibility to establish a new government. Another theory, however, is that Prigozhin never had any intentions of overthrowing Putin. Rather, he might have become aware of the case already being built against him for treason by the FSB and other Russian legal agencies. Sergei Shoigu, for one, was very motivated to remove Prigozhin as a rival and could wield the Russian legal apparatus to do just that. Prigozhin was also proving to be a thorn in Putin's side, with moves that some took as seditious or outright challenges to Putin's power. Knowing the consequences of legal charges against him, Prigozhin might have seen an armed insurrection as his only option, and knowing how weak the Russian army was, he could have calculated that all he needed to do was get close to Moscow to force Putin into pardoning him. This would have been a calculated risk, but one very well calculated, and could explain why Wagner opted to launch an attack south toward Rostov-on-Don from the Ukrainian border and north toward Moscow instead of massing for one massive thrust northwards. Capturing a major city like Rostov-on-Don, which housed the southern military district's headquarters, and Voronezh would have rattled Putin significantly, as both cities are of critical importance to the war effort. Further, if Prigozhin had seriously wanted to launch a coup, he could have had coordinated better with Russian partisan forces such as the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom of Russia Legion. Working together, Prigozhin's coup would have been even more devastating, with attacks across multiple Russian regions throwing the government and the military into further disarray. The fact that despite seizing major cities, Prigozhin never took to broadcasting over regular Russian media also speaks to the conclusion that Prigozhin was never serious about removing Putin from power. Wagner and Prigozhin were both immediately cut off from most of their social media channels, and Russian media had been banned from mentioning either Wagner or Prigozhin for weeks already. Even as President Putin addressed the nation over the crisis, he never mentioned Prigozhin or Wagner by name. Prigozhin could have made his case to the Russian public over traditional media via the numerous broadcast options captured inside of Rostov-on-Don and Voronezh, yet there appears to be no evidence that he did this. That would be a very curious omission for a man attempting to launch a coup on the government, but perfectly in line if the plan was always to simply rattle the government's cage and force them into a pardon and major concessions preventing Prigozhin from being prosecuted. A final theory, and one that seems increasingly unlikely in the wake of the insurrection, is that this was all for show. Putin and Prigozhin could have organized the entire thing as a way of pinning the blame on the failing war on Sergei Shoigu and General Gerasimov. Prigozhin made numerous statements blaming the Ministry of Defense for misleading the president into this disastrous war, even outright calling typical Russian talking points of Ukraine or NATO preparing to attack Russia false fabrications made up by the Ministry of Defense. Even once the insurrection was launched, Prigozhin never made any mention of removing Putin, stating numerous times that he was still loyal to the office of the president. Then again, this might have just been personal cover by making it seem like he only intended to remove Shoigu and Gerasimov from power. But it could have been carefully orchestrated theater to avoid a direct challenge to Putin and excuse Prigozhin later as a well-meaning patriot who took things a little bit too far. However, we have yet to see the removal of either Shoigu or Gerasimov, and there is no indication that Putin is considering putting an end to his failed war. Thus, it becomes more and more unlikely that this was the case. The truth behind Prigozhin's coup may not be known for weeks, months, or even years to come, when other secrets of this war come to light. But given the absolute clown shoes level of stupidity and incompetence the modern Russian Federation has displayed in the last year and 4 months, absolutely no theory would surprise any of us anymore. At this point, we're even willing to believe that Prigozhin simply marched Wagner in the wrong direction. And by the time he realized he was invading Russia, he just decided to roll with it in order to avoid the embarrassment and take his chances. One thing is for sure though, only Ukraine benefits from this chaos. Many pro-revolution activists did their part by flooding Russian media channels with calls for civil war and memes. When the story of this war is written in history books, rest assured that many people did their part in the fight for freedom by trolling as hard as they possibly could. Now see how people are continuing to fight the good fight by checking out analyzing Russia's massive failures in war against Ukraine, or click this other video instead. Mobile infantry made us the men we are today.